July 7, 1985. A quiet suburban home in Dorado Hills, California. A woman who had only moved in the day before was found stabbed 29 times in an upstairs bedroom. The man who called 911 was the one they arrested. The man who called 911 was the one they convicted. And the man who called 911 spent 15 years inside a prison cell for a murder he did not commit. For 35 years the real killer walked free. He had been there that night. His DNA was on the body. His name had even been spoken once by a 13-year-old girl at the scene who told police she had been with him hours before the murder. Investigators wrote it down. Then they closed their notebooks and looked the other way. What followed was one of the most devastating failures in California criminal justice history. A wrongful conviction built on a confession that was never true, testimony manufactured inside an interrogation room, and a forensic system that in 1985 simply could not read what the evidence was trying to say. But the evidence waited. It sat in storage for decades, a nightgown, a bite mark, a trace of saliva left behind by a killer who believed time had already erased him. He was wrong. Because the same DNA technology that unmasked the Golden State Killer would eventually reach back 35 years into that upstairs bedroom in Dorado Hills, and when it did, it accomplished something that had never been done before in the state of California. It didn't just identify a killer. It proved, beyond any scientific doubt, that the man sitting in prison was innocent, and that the man who actually committed the murder had been living free, in plain sight, for over 3 decades. This is the story of Jane Hylton, who deserved justice from the very first day, of Ricky Leo Davis, who lost 15 years of his life to a system that failed him completely, and of a single piece of biological evidence no larger than a tooth mark on a shoulder that refused to let either of them be forgotten. Before we go further, let us know where you are watching from. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe now. Because every name behind these cases deserves to be told. Dorado Hills, California, 1985. 30 miles east of Sacramento, tucked into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. Dorado Hills was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted a quieter life, wide streets, ranch-style homes, neighbors who waved from their driveways. It was suburban California at its most ordinary, the kind of community where people left their doors unlocked and assumed the worst things happened somewhere else. Jane Hylton was 54 years old. She wrote a column for the Foothills Times, a local newspaper, and by every account she was a woman people genuinely liked, warm, hardworking. The kind of person who showed up in the community and made it feel a little smaller, a little closer. But in the summer of 1985, Jane Hylton's personal life had become difficult. Her marriage was falling apart. She needed somewhere safe to go, somewhere to take her 13-year-old daughter and simply breathe. Her employer, a woman named Wilma Klein, opened her home without hesitation. The Klein house in Dorado Hills was already occupied. Wilma's grandson, a 20-year-old named Ricky Davis, was living there with his 19-year-old girlfriend, Connie Dahl. Ricky Davis was not a complicated young man. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, no reason for anyone to look at him twice. He was a young man in his grandmother's house, figuring out his life the way 20-year-olds do. On the evening of July 6, 1985, he and Connie Dahl did what young couples do on a Saturday night. They went to a party. They came home at 3:30 in the morning. What they found when they walked through that door would follow Ricky Davis for the rest of his life. Jane Hylton was upstairs. She had been stabbed 29 times. Her body was in the master bedroom. She was already gone. Davis did what anyone would do. He called 911. But there was something else, something investigators noted carefully when they processed the scene that night and photographed the body in that upstairs room. On Jane Hylton's left shoulder, there was a bite mark, human, deliberate, left behind by whoever had been close enough to her in those final moments to leave a piece of themselves on her skin without even knowing it. In 1985, that bite mark was a detail, a photograph in a file, a note in a report. No one in that house on the night of July 6th could have known that 35 years later, that single mark on a dead woman's shoulder would become the key that unlocked everything. But before it unlocked anything, it would first be used to lock away the wrong man. Dorado County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the Klein house in the early morning hours of July 7, 1985. 3 people were present when they got there: Ricky Davis, Connie Dahl, and Jane Hylton's 13-year-old daughter, Autumn, who had come home that night to find her mother dead. Davis led the deputies upstairs to the body. Investigators worked the scene. They collected Jane Hylton's nightgown, the one she had been wearing when she was killed. They photographed the stab wounds, 29 of them. They documented the bite mark on her left shoulder with the careful attention that evidence like that demands, because a bite mark is not random. A bite mark is a signature. Whoever left it had been close, had been present, had left something of themselves behind, in a way they could not take back. The question was, who? Autumn Hylton, 13 years old, had not been in the house when her mother was killed. She had been in a park that night with 3 young men. She gave investigators their first names, 3 boys, teenagers. She had been with them for hours on the night her mother was murdered, in a park not far from the house where Jane Hylton was dying. Investigators wrote the names down, and then the trail went cold. There was no DNA testing in 1985, not in the way that would matter here. Forensic science in that era could examine a bite mark, could photograph it, could bring in an expert to study the pattern, but it could not extract a genetic profile from the saliva left behind. It could not upload that profile to a database and find a match. The technology that would eventually read the truth out of that nightgown simply did not exist yet. The evidence was collected, preserved, filed away, and the investigation, without a clear path forward, quietly ran out of road. 14 years passed. Jane Hylton's case sat in storage. The nightgown, the photographs, the bite mark documentation, all of it waiting for something the world did not yet have the tools to provide. 14 years passed. Jane Hylton, November 1999, 14 years after Jane Hylton was murdered. The El Dorado County Sheriff's Office reopened the case. Cold case detectives had a lead, or what they believed was a lead. Connie Dahl, Ricky Davis's former girlfriend, the woman who had been with him at that party on the night of July 6th, was sitting in a prison in Oregon on drug charges. She was reachable, she was vulnerable, and investigators believed she knew something. What happened next would take years to fully unravel. N's case sat in storage. The nightgown, the photographs, the bite mark documentation, all of it waiting for something the world did not yet have the tools to provide. Detectives interrogated Connie Dahl 4 times over the course of 18 months. 4 separate sessions, sustained, persistent, and conducted using techniques that researchers and legal experts have since identified as methods known to produce false confessions. The kind of interrogation that doesn't search for the truth so much as it constructs one, slowly across multiple sessions, until the person in the chair begins to reflect back whatever the person asking the questions already believes. Dahl's story changed. By the end of those 18 months, she was telling investigators that Ricky Davis had killed Jane Hylton, that she had been there, that she had participated, and that the bite mark on Hylton's left shoulder, the one carefully photographed and documented by investigators on the morning of July 7, 1985, had been made by her. There was one catastrophic problem with that testimony. The detectives had told Dahl about the bite mark before she ever mentioned it herself. They had introduced the detail, she had absorbed it, and then she had repeated it back to them as her own memory, as her own confession, as evidence of her own presence at a murder scene on a night when the real killer had already walked away clean. That is not a confession, that is contamination. And it should never have been enough to take a man to trial. But it was. In August 2005, 20 years after Jane Hylton was murdered, Ricky Leo Davis stood in a California courtroom and heard a jury find him guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 16 years to life in state prison. He was 40 years old. He had spent his entire adult life maintaining the same position he had held since the morning he called 911. That he had come home from a party, found his grandmother's housemate dead, and done exactly what an innocent person does. He had no motive. He had no history of violence. Not a single piece of physical evidence placed him at the scene of that murder in any meaningful way. The case against him rested almost entirely on the testimony of a woman who had been interrogated 4 times in a prison cell, until her story became the one investigators wanted to hear. A jury believed her. And Ricky Davis went to prison. There was one catastrophic problem with that testimony. The detectives had told Dahl about the bite mark before she ever mentioned it herself. They had introduced the detail, she had absorbed it, and then she had repeated it back to them as her own memory, as her own confession, as evidence of her own presence at a murder scene on a night when the real killer had already walked away clean. That is not a confession. That is contamination. And it should never have been enough to take a man to trial. But it was. In August 2005, 20 years after Jane Hylton was murdered, Ricky Leo Davis stood in a California courtroom and heard a jury find him guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 16 years to life in state prison. Year after year, through more than a decade inside a California state prison, he refused. He had called 911. He had cooperated from the very first moment. He had told the same story in 1985 that he told in 2005, that he would tell in 2010 and beyond, because it was the only story he had, and it was the truth. Pleading guilty to a murder he did not commit was not a price he was willing to pay for his own freedom. So he stayed, and he waited, and he kept insisting in the way that only a person who knows the full weight of what they are insisting can insist, that he had not killed Jane Hylton. Most people stopped listening, but not everyone. In 2014, forensic experts began what would later be described as an extremely meticulous process, a careful, methodical re-examination of the physical evidence collected from the Klein house on the morning of July 7, 1985. The nightgown, the bite mark, the trace biological material preserved on that fabric through nearly 3 decades in storage. What they found changed everything. The DNA recovered from Jane Hylton's nightgown did not belong to Ricky Davis. It did not belong to Connie Dahl. It did not belong to Autumn Hylton. It belonged to an unknown male, someone whose genetic profile was entirely absent from every piece of the story that had been constructed in that courtroom in 2005. Someone who had never been named, someone who had never been charged, someone who, for 30 years, had existed in this case as nothing more than a trace of saliva on a dead woman's shoulder. And that single finding dismantled Connie Dahl's testimony from the ground up, because Dahl had told the jury she had made that bite mark, that she had been there, that the mark was hers, but the DNA said otherwise clearly, definitively, without any ambiguity. The bite mark had been made by a man whose identity the science of 1985 could not have revealed, but whose presence in that bedroom on the night of the murder was now written into the evidence in language that could not be argued away. In 2018, the Northern California Innocence Project at Santa Clara University School of Law took Ricky Davis's case and walked into court with that evidence. Their argument was precise that had this DNA analysis been available at the time of trial, the outcome would almost certainly have been different, that the foundation on which the conviction rested had not just cracked, it had collapsed entirely. The court agreed. In April 2019, Judge Kenneth Malikian reversed Ricky Davis's murder conviction. But Davis was not free yet. The El Dorado County District Attorney's Office announced its intention to retry him. Reversing a conviction is not the same as exoneration. Without a name to put to that unknown DNA, without a real suspect, the system had not yet finished with him. The nightgown had proved what Ricky Davis was not. Now someone had to prove who the killer actually was. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the method. For most of the history of forensic DNA analysis, the system worked in one direction. You collected biological evidence, you built a genetic profile, and then you compared it against a database of known offenders, people who had already been convicted of crimes and whose DNA had been entered into the system by law enforcement. If your unknown profile matched a profile already in that database, you had your answer. If it didn't, you had nothing. That was the limit. And the unknown male whose DNA was on Jane Hylton's nightgown existed precisely beyond that limit. He had no prior convictions. His DNA had never been entered into any law enforcement database. The traditional system simply could not see him. But in April 2018, investigators working a separate decades-old California case used an entirely different approach. They uploaded an unknown DNA profile not into a law enforcement database, but into GeneMatch, a public genealogy platform, where over 1 million ordinary people had voluntarily submitted their own DNA to find relatives and trace family lines. What those investigators discovered was that the system didn't need to find the exact person. It found their family, distant cousins, second cousins, third cousins, people who shared enough genetic material with the unknown profile to confirm a biological relationship, even across generations, even across state lines. And from those distant connections, a skilled investigator could build a family tree, branch by branch, record by record. narrowing the possibilities until only one name remained. That case was the Golden State Killer, and the method it proved worked was about to be applied to Dorado Hills. El Dorado County District Attorney Vern Pearson partnered with the Sacramento County Crime Lab and uploaded the unknown male DNA from Jane Hylton's nightgown into public genealogy databases. Matches came back. The tree began to take shape. Investigators followed each branch through birth records, marriage certificates, census data, and public archives, the quiet paper trail that every human life leaves behind without intending to. And as the tree narrowed, it pointed back towards something that had been sitting in the case file since 1985. The three boys, the teenagers in the park. The first names that Autumn Hylton had given investigators on the morning her mother was found dead, names that had been written down, noted, and never meaningfully pursued. The DNA was already pointing at one of them. His name was Michael Eric Green. He had been one of those three teenagers in the park on the night of July 6, 1985. He had spent hours with Autumn Hylton while her mother was being stabbed 29 times less than a mile away. And the DNA recovered from Jane Hylton's nightgown, the saliva preserved in that bite mark, through 35 years in storage matched him. Green was arrested in Roseville, California in February 2020. He was 54 years old, the same age as Ricky Davis. He had been a juvenile on the night of the murder, which meant that by law he was required to make his first court appearances in the juvenile system, even though he was now a man in his 50s. One of the other three boys from that night was already dead. The third was cooperating with investigators and was not believed to have participated in the killing, though he may have known about it afterward. Autumn Hylton, the 13-year-old girl who had given investigators those first names in 1985, whose testimony had always contained the answer, helped identify Green as the new suspect. She had carried that night with her for 35 years. The names she gave in 1985 had been in the file the entire time. In late July 2022, Michael Eric Green pleaded no contest to second-degree murder for the killing of Jane Hylton. He was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. El Dorado County District Attorney Vern Pearson stood before the cameras and said what needed to be said without softening it. Justice has been served, but it took too long and some awful mistakes were made in the past to get to this moment. He personally apologized to Ricky Davis. He personally apologized to Jane Hylton's family. The words were necessary. They were also, by any measure, insufficient. But they were said, on the record, by the office that had put the wrong man away, and that matters, even when it cannot repair what was broken. February 13, 2020. El Dorado County Courthouse, Placerville, California. Ricky Leo Davis was 54 years old. He had been 20 when Jane Hylton moved into his grandmother's house. He had been 20 when he came home from a party and found her dead and called 911. He had been 40 when a jury sent him to prison for it, and he had spent every year between then and now inside a system that had decided, on the basis of contaminated testimony and the complete absence of physical evidence connecting him to the crime, that he was a murderer. He walked into that courtroom one final time. District Attorney Vern Pearson filed a motion to dismiss all charges, not a retrial, not a negotiated arrangement, a full dismissal, and alongside it, a request for a finding of factual innocence, not simply that reasonable doubt existed, not simply that the evidence was thin, but that Ricky Leo Davis did not commit this crime, that the state of California was prepared to say so out loud, in open court, on the record. Permanently, Judge Kenneth Malikian reviewed the motion. Then he turned toward Ricky Davis, and he declared him factually innocent. Innocence Project attorney Melissa O'Connell turned to Davis and thanked him for his tremendous strength and resilience, and for never giving up hope. Those words, never giving up hope, carried the full weight of what 15 years of refusal actually looked like. 15 years of declining plea deals that would have traded his freedom for a lie. 15 years of telling the same true story to people who had long since stopped believing it. 15 years of waiting for a technology that didn't exist yet to finally say out loud what he had always known. He walked out of El Dorado County Jail that same afternoon, a free man, factually innocent, 54 years old. But freedom and restoration are not the same thing. And the story did not end cleanly at those courthouse steps. Davis was later reported to be struggling, to be homeless, to be carrying the full weight of what had been taken from him without any of the stability or support that most people take for granted. In August 2020, he filed a claim seeking $18 million from El Dorado County, not as greed, but as the only language the system provides for what was done to him, a number placed against years, a dollar figure assigned to a life that was interrupted at 40 and handed back at 54 with nothing intact, no amount resolves that, no ruling restores it. Exoneration is the beginning of something, not the end. And Ricky Davis's life after prison is the part of this story that the press conference cannot capture, the long, quiet aftermath of a failure that the system acknowledged but could not undo. El Dorado County District Attorney Vern Pearson stood before the cameras and said what needed to be said without softening it. Justice has been served, but it took too long and some awful mistakes were made in the past to get to this moment. He personally apologized to Ricky Davis. He personally apologized to Jane Hylton's family. The words were necessary. They were also, by any measure, insufficient. But they were said, on the record, by the office that had put the wrong man away, and that matters, even when it cannot repair what was broken. The first is about interrogation. Connie Dahl did not walk into that Oregon prison in 1999 with a confession ready to give. She was questioned 4 times over 18 months using techniques that researchers have consistently linked to false confessions. She was told details about the crime before she mentioned them herself, and slowly her story shifted until it matched what investigators already believed. That is not how truth is found. That is how truth is replaced. Coercive interrogation has placed innocent people in prison across this country in numbers. The justice system has been painfully slow to confront. The Davis case is a reminder that the methods used inside interrogation rooms carry consequences that can stretch across decades, and those methods deserve far more scrutiny than they have historically received. The second lesson is about what DNA can do. For most of its history in criminal justice, DNA has been understood as a tool for conviction. The Davis case proved it can work in both directions at once. The same evidence that identified Michael Eric Green as Jane Hylton's killer also dismantled the false testimony that had convicted an innocent man. Genetic genealogy freed Ricky Davis and arrested the real killer from the same piece of fabric that had been in storage since 1985, for every family with a loved one in prison for a crime they say they did not commit. The question worth asking is whether the biological evidence in that case has been fully examined with today's technology. What could not be read 10 years ago may be readable now. The third lesson is about the people who fight when the system stops fighting. The Northern California Innocence Project did not take Ricky Davis's case because it was straightforward or guaranteed. They took it because the evidence deserved a closer look, and because a man who had maintained his innocence for over a decade deserved someone standing beside him. Innocence Project organizations operate across this country, in nearly every state, and they have freed hundreds of wrongly convicted people on the basis of a single principle, that factual innocence matters more than finality, and that no conviction is beyond examination if the evidence demands it. If you know someone serving time for a crime they did not commit, that is where the conversation begins. No case is too old. The Davis case proved that the truth can survive 35 years in storage and still come out intact. Ricky Leo Davis was 54 years old the day he walked out of that jail. He went in at 40. He will never get those years back. Exoneration is not restoration. A judge declaring you factually innocent does not return the decades or rebuild what was lost while the system looked the other way. That is the part of this story that does not resolve. That is the part that stays. Jane Hylton was murdered. The man who murdered her is now in prison. The man wrongly convicted for her murder walked free in 2022 and is still living with the consequences of a failure that was never his to carry. Justice arrived. But it arrived 35 years late, and it left damage behind that no courtroom declaration can fully undo. If this story stayed with you, if the names Jane Hylton and Ricky Leo Davis mean something to you now that they did not before, then subscribe. Every case in this series belongs to a real person. Every name behind these files has a family that has been waiting, sometimes for decades, for the world to stop and pay attention. You being here is why we keep telling these stories. We will see you in the next case.